former Treasury Assistant Secretary David Pearl joins me now. David, thanks for your time. Look, there seems to be no care for responsible spending or fiscal restraint or even proper answers about how they're going to pay for this. Do those responses that we just heard concern you?
They do, Sharri, but they don't surprise me. Obviously, the focus groups aren't showing that people in marginal electorates are complaining about deficits and debt. But just to be more serious, clearly the government's election spend-a-thon is not being funded. If there is a funding strategy, Sharri, it's a combination of bracket creep, which both the government and the opposition continue to support, and future debt on our children's generation.
Yeah, it's so worrying, and we know the budget figures show that next financial year it's forecast to hit $1 trillion in debt. David, I want to ask you about the economy more broadly. We know inflation isn't back to target band yet, but now we're seeing this discussion about whether there could be a rate cut as a result of Trump's tariffs. So how do you see the Australian economy and inflation for the remainder of this year?
Well, the economy, I don't think is out of the woods as far as inflation is concerned. The RBA at its last meeting was concerned, Sharri, about a still tight labour market, which hasn't been loosening at all, and moderate wage growth, but productivity still flatlining. Activity is also picking up, and overlaid on that, Sharri, of course, is both major parties' spending plans in the election. So leaving aside the uncertainty associated with Trump's tariffs, I don't think that we're clearly over inflation. And of course, if both the government and the opposition were committing to tightening spending, it would be much easier for the RBA board to cut rates and inflation would be much lower.
So you're of course saying there that irrespective of who wins, all of this big spending could be inflationary, basically. It could ultimately see rates either held for longer or possibly even hiking again.
Well, the other point I wanted to make, Sharri, is that if you look at the supply side of our economy, we've had too much demand in recent years because of government spending. But on the supply side, we're effectively imposing a tariff on energy and we've re-regulated our industrial relations system. So the supply or growth potential of the economy is less. And that's why, even though disposable incomes have fallen more in Australia than any other OECD country, we still are not out of the woods as far as inflation is concerned. So it's a collapse of supply, but the weak demand is not defeating inflation. So that is a concern. The Trump tariff, as you know, Sharri, could affect inflation either way. If a flood of Chinese and other goods hit Australian shores, if Chinese demand for Australian raw materials drops, then that would be deflationary. But of course, if there are global supply chain disruptions, then that would have the opposite effect. So again, I don't think the RBA should be cutting prematurely. They should be waiting for the hard data.
I want to ask you about housing policy. We saw the Treasurer during another debate with Angus Taylor last night. He was asked if anybody had actually moved into one of the houses. Have a look.
Is a single person living in one of these houses from this program?
We've built a couple of thousand.
Has a single person actually moved into one of these houses?
We've built a couple of thousand houses. There's 28,000 more in the pipeline right now, and there'll be fewer under your proposal because you want to cut the Housing Australia Future Fund.
So
that
the truth
would mean
is,
fewer homes.
Not a single person is living in one of these houses.
I mean, that's concerning, isn't it? That billions literally are being promised for 1.2 million new homes by the end of the decade, just in 5 years' time, and yet not one new house has actually been constructed, according to Katie Gallagher's own admission.
Well, again, it's not a surprise because it reminds me of Bob Hawke's election promise many years ago that no child shall live in poverty. Governments and oppositions roll out these promises and these ambitious targets, but if you look at the nitty-gritty details, as housing experts have made clear in recent days, local government planning and zoning, shortage of materials, and a whole range of other supply-side factors are limiting our capacity to provide additional housing to Australian people. So again, the government just gets the headline that it's going to build these houses, but the consequences of that dishonesty won't be clear until after the election.
Yeah, all right. David Pearl, always good to have your independent analysis on the show. Thank you very much for joining us.